Let's get joined up. Today's show is brought to you by Audible, and right now you can get a free audiobook download and 30-day free trial at audibletrial.com/joined-up. There's over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle or MP3 player. So thanks for tuning in to the Joined Up Writing Podcast, a regular show about all things writing, including interviews with authors, screenwriters, and key figures from the publishing industry, plus loads of hints, tips, and inspiration for all kinds of creatives. You can follow us on Twitter at JU Podcast, leave a quick iTunes review, or just tell a friend. Right, cue that cheesy theme tune.
Put down your pen and stop your typing. Grab yourself a drink, 'cause it's Joined Up Writing.
Hello and welcome to the Joined Up Writing Podcast, where a little procrastination can go a long way. I'm Wayne Kelly, and it's episode 115 with Bill Beverly, author of the multi-award-winning novel Dodgers. He talks about how he found his way to what became a highly successful book by way of short stories and a failed screenplay attempt, as well as giving an insight into his writing process, so it's a great chat. Before we dive into that, just a reminder that I always love to hear what you're up to with your own creative endeavours and your writing projects. So if you want me to give you a mention, or you've got a question for me or future guests, do get in touch by tweeting me at JUPodcast or emailing wayne@waynekellyWrites.com, as I'd love to hear from you. Also, don't forget to join the email mailing list at joinedupwriting.co.uk to get free stuff and to be the first to find out about upcoming shows and events. So for my part, I've been busy doing everything except writing my novel since we last spoke. That's not to say I haven't been productive, continuing to revise my scripts for 2 upcoming short film projects, as well as working on the pre-production for the first of those that we're filming in a few weeks' time. I also edited a short 9-minute documentary, the follow-up to a film we made back in 2012 with inspirational artist Adebanji Alade. The new film's available to watch for free right now on YouTube, and I'll put the link to that in the show notes for today's show. It's called Life Lessons of an Artist, and it's full of inspiration for creatives of all types, so go and check it out and do let me know what you think. Right, let's not hang about and get right to today's chat with Bill Beverly. So Bill was born and grew up in Kalamazoo, Michigan. He studied literature and writing at Oberlin College, including time in London studying theatre and the Industrial Revolution. His research on criminal fugitives and the stories surrounding them became the book On the Lam, Narratives of Flight in J. Edgar Hoover's America. He now teaches American literature and writing at Trinity University in Washington D.C, which is where he was speaking from during our chat, and his multi-award-winning debut novel Dodgers is out right now. Excellent. Well, thanks so much for joining me on Joined Up Writing. I really appreciate it. So why don't we start off by giving people a sense of where you're speaking from and how tell us how things are going.
I'm in my office at Trinity College in Washington, D.C. I've worked here. This is my 17th year, and classes begin a week from today, which means things aren't going too well.
That's good. Have you had a good summer?
Up and down. It's been good and warm.
Well, that's something, I suppose. So why don't you start off by telling us a little bit about sort of how I came to know about you was through your excellent novel, Dodgers. So why don't you tell our listeners a little bit more about that? What is Dodgers? Give us a sense of the premise.
Oh, thanks for the kind word. Dodgers is about a 15-year-old kid from a neighborhood in Los Angeles called the Boxes. He guards a house. He guards a drug house. He works for a drug organization run by his uncle. And in the second chapter of the book, something goes wrong with his job. A house is raided. A house is taken down. And it is his job to keep this from happening. When it goes ahead and happens, it seems as though he's going to be the one to take the fall for this, but he's offered an option. That option is to get in a van to travel across the United States to murder a man. He's never left Los Angeles before, and he's never involved himself in anything like murder before, so this is a new experience on all counts for him. And Dodgers is a story of what happens to him. His name is East.
Yeah, well, it's, as I say, I really enjoyed it. So where did that idea come from? What was kind of your jumping off point for it?
Well, in the longer sense of the question, I'd done a doctorate in American literature at the University of Florida in the 90s. And while doing that, I had studied a lot of fugitive stories in general from the 30s, 40s, but newer ones as well. I read a great many American slave narratives to get ready to write about Richard Wright and Ralph Ellison. Enough of these stories that they began to sort of bake together in the sort of leaky oven of my mind, where I'd begun to lose the particulars of this one or that one and just begun to sort of remember the whole group of them fused together. And so that experience or that type of narrative had become really, really important to me. And I'd been looking for its resurfacing as I teach American Lit in all sorts of American stories, penned by Black and non-Black writers. I'd been really intrigued at the same time by Richard Price's book Clockers, which I think came out in about 1990, I think, or maybe a couple of years after, and a film was made of it by Spike Lee. I was very interested in the end of that story, why it ended where it ended, what might have happened next. That next book is a book that Mr. Price never wrote, for which I'm grateful. It opens up a sort of imaginative space where Dodgers lives. And in the much shorter sense of the question, the story of East came to me one day in the shower, and it came largely complete, largely intact. And it was a great many years between that shower and the book coming out.
As it always often is the case with writing a book.
Yeah. Seemed a good enough story to keep and to develop. And so I kept it and developed it.
And kind of went from there. And obviously this is a kind of classic kind of road trip story. It's kind of got that structure. Was that a conscious thing? Once you'd sort of decided on the story, was the idea, was just the nature of the story that it was always going to be on the road, or was that a conscious way of giving yourself that kind of structure? Because, by the very nature of it, it's driving forward, well, literally as well. And you're kind of going towards this, there's a clock on it, there's a time limit of when they're supposed to be doing this by and what they're supposed to be doing. So was that ever in your mind, or was it really just that was the story and that was that?
That was always going to be the story. And it's only since I started writing another book that I've become fully conscious of, or maybe fully grateful for, the advantages. The emergency vehicles are going by my office. It's another.
It's very on brand with what we're talking about, though, I suppose.
Yeah, another freshman being brought in. Very grateful for the advantages of writing a book with that sort of built-in propulsion. There's that Chandler quote, which I am sure to misquote here, about whenever I feel that whenever I need something to happen in the story, the door opens and a man walks in with a gun. And when your characters are in a car traveling somewhere, there is no Deus Ex Machina, right? The roads are strange enough and random enough that whatever comes around the next turn really belongs around the next turn.
Yeah. Well, I mean, on that, as you say, that sense of they don't know where this sense of discovery and stuff, that really comes across, and this idea that all of the youngsters, because of the world that most of them are from, not all of them, but most of them are from, you do really get this sense of discovery and wonderment. It's almost like they're visiting alien planets almost as they go out of LA and into the wilderness sort of thing. That really came across to me. How did you sort of get into that kind of mindset when you were writing? Was there a lot of research involved?
Well, if there was research, it was research I did in the 90s, working on not just on fugitive stories, but on the way in which the African American experience of the American road and the mythic American space differs from my own. I came from a Michigan family who a white family who believed it our absolute birthright to climb in the Dodge and gas it up and drive wherever we wanted to within the United States, which is environmentally horrific, but mythically sort of beautiful way of experiencing the world and discovering the world. And even if you're locked in the back of a Dodge station wagon with your parents as shepherds, it still is a sort of voyage of radical discovery. It's eye-popping, but you also have that experience of coming over a rise and looking at another town full of people whom you'll probably never meet and whose lives you'll probably never get very close to. This is a fairly typical American experience, but it's much, one is at great advantage to experience it as a white kid with that sense of enfranchisement that we in America tend to give to some people and not to others.
Sure. And as a white writer writing these black characters, did you kind of feel a sense of responsibility, or did you kind of have sort of trusted readers, maybe black colleagues or whatever, that you wanted to read this and to make sure that, from your point of view, that you weren't taking liberties with it, or that it sort of felt real and it felt sincere? How important was that to you?
Yeah, sure. Both are true. I had a night when I was so mostly through a first draft where I woke up and thought, what are you doing, man? What do you think? What do you think you're doing here? At the same time, I had discussions and exchanged pages with a couple writers whose perspective on this I really valued, and who said, here you are, you gotta do what you do and consider what you have to consider. And there was a moment where I thought, well, I could change the characters radically. I could change where they're from. I could change their race. I could change any number of things, and yet that would have been a dislocation and a re-envisioning of the story that I think would have changed its meaning pretty irreparably. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, I chose to let the story I had originally envisioned just keep going and succeed or fail on its own merits.
Well, obviously succeeded, so congrats from that point of view. And in terms of the POV that you kind of chose for the book, it's kind of a close third-person POV that you've got going in the book. Did you ever consider using first-person for it? Because it's kind of seen as a quite close perspective of your main character, East.
Yeah, no, I didn't. But the one strangeness in the conception of the book is that for a while I was writing it as a screenplay, and one learns, when one learns to write a screenplay, to write your stage directions in very brief, very truncated form, right? Yeah. To get through them as quickly as possible so that the dialogue is not bogged down in these huge paragraphs of setup, right? Mm-hmm. As if you're Tennessee Williams or Arthur Miller, right? You want to avoid that. And there was I got 3, 4, 5 chapters in and realized that I was writing scenes that I didn't really know how to do in screenplay form, that I had never tried a screenplay before. I was setting myself up to, if not to fail, at least to be very, very lost. And I just started writing them in fiction. So the point of view, I never really considered making it first person story, but the style of the close third narration still has vestiges, particularly in the opening chapters, of that ethic, that commandment in screenplay writing, that everything be incredibly terse.
Yeah, it's almost like hard-boiled almost at the beginning. It kind of got, as you say, that kind of that very brief, succinct kind of description, putting us right in there straight away. But it really works because it, especially at the early part of the novel, because it is a more urban environment, and we are in these streets, and before the novel kind of opens up into these big wide spaces and stuff. So I suppose the contrast works quite well.
One wants one's style to match somehow the sensibility of the characters as well, and I think that the protagonist, I think East, is a incredibly fast moving perceiver who brooks no nonsense, and would tend to process things very quickly, very tersely himself.
And he's a man of few words.
Usually, yes.
Yeah. Usually, yeah. So, tell us a little bit about your background. So, where you've kind of alluded to it earlier on, but kind of where you grew up and some of the stuff that you did before you settled into writing. Obviously, you teach writing now. Yeah.
What can I tell you? I grew up in a fortunate small city in Michigan. Half of Michigan, the eastern half, is the rubble left behind by the American auto industry. I suspect your listeners will have heard about Flint and the poisoned water and the utter abuse of the citizens of Michigan by its ex-governor and by many public officials. I grew up in the lucky half of Michigan, in a town called Kalamazoo, which is, has had the good luck to have a sort of diversified set of industries and an economy that has not collapsed as Eastern Michigan's has, and Western Michigan is still an industrial place, but relatively pleasant and relatively successful. And I was lucky to go to very, very good public schools. I wanted to I wanted to play soccer for my life, and might have run myself against a ground on the rocks of that if I hadn't torn up a knee as a teenager and really not been able to come back from that. I didn't allow myself to write really until I saw other college students, friends of mine at college, beginning to do creative work, and I was seized with horrific envy at my friends who were musicians or artists or writers, and beginning, at 18, 19, 20 to do this really fabulous work. And I jumped at that train, but only kind of caught the very last car. And it took a long time for me to actually consider myself as a creative person.
Mm-hmm. And were you drawn to other creative pursuits, or was it immediately writing? How did that kind of pan out for you?
Oh, yeah, I can't carry a tune. It would have to be writing.
Or paint, or draw?
No. There's no sort of broad field of talent here.
You and me both.
Yeah.
So when did you, what are kind of your earliest memories of writing? I mean, was writing something you did as a kid in amongst the sport and everything else, or?
Yeah, I did, and I was convinced that I would be a writer, and yet I, being a 10, 11, 12, 13-year-old kid in an industrial town, you tend to give away those aspirations just so you can transition into older boyhood without being beat up.
Sure.
You say, well, I'll be a football player and a longshoreman and be in the Army, and it took a long time before the possibility, quite frankly, occurred to me again.
And so, and what sorts of things? What were your kind of earliest memories of writing? What were the first sort of things that you were working on, would you say, or that you remember writing and enjoying?
Oh, I wrote some long derivative. There was an Art Buchwald novel about a cat, which I found adorable and very funny, and I remember plagiarizing it fairly fairly extensively at the age of 5 or 6 or 7. The stealing more or less everything and changing names and dialogue. But I remember writing a long assignment about a family once. But no, I didn't write creatively until college, after I was very young.
And did anybody kind of in your family, or did any of your teachers at any point sort of praise you, or talk about some promise? Because that's often quite a big thing, isn't it, when you're younger, getting that kind of encouragement from somewhere?
Oh, well, I could always write myself out of trouble, but it was never particularly creative writing. I fancied myself. I went to college thinking I'd go into government or something where some sort of substantial matter would be at the heart of my writing. It turned out I couldn't do the reading. I couldn't abide it. I found the classes deadly dull and went back to literature, because at least that was a list of books that I would open.
That you'd actually wanted to read, yeah.
Precisely, yes, sir.
Yeah, absolutely. So you kind of so you found yourself going into teaching creative writing, and did you always have aspirations to do something for yourself? I think you used to. Am I right in thinking that you used to write short stories?
I did. I spent a good long time writing short stories and proved myself to be sort of on the lower end of mediocre. I've written a few short stories that I liked well, but I can't say that I've ever had a particularly natural sense of the form. Though I admire them enormously and read a good deal of poetry too. I tried that and have a half a dozen to a dozen relatively obscure publications. No, I didn't consider when one studies creative writing in America, one usually is pushed towards the shorter forms, towards poetry and short stories, simply because those forms are sustainable in the structure of the workshop of the class, right? It's very, very hard to have a group of students writing 300-page novels and
not being able to critique them and everything else.
Right, exactly. So I think that prose writers who practice it first in college tend to wind up with the short story form, which is a perfectly great form to work in. But not all of us are particularly good at it. I took a course when I was about 30 or 35 years old with a writer who's now in Indianapolis, a fellow named Dan Barden, who looked at one of my short stories and said, look, this is kind of interesting because you're just beginning to develop some drama here, and you're on page 15, and it's clearly your instinct to say, no, the party's over. It's time to shut out the lights and go home.
Yeah.
He said, try giving this 200 or 300 pages and see where it goes.
And so was Dodgers the first time that you sat down to do that, or had you, because it's often not, the first fiction novel that someone gets published is usually not the actual first book that they wrote. Was that the case with you? No,
it was the second. I'd written a very long, maybe 700 or 800 page novel about a high school football coach. And it has 50 or 75 pages of very, very good writing in it. And then many hundred pages of trying to sort of step around until one falls down the rabbit hole of an ending. I'm not sure it ever finds that. It resides in a drawer, or actually a couple of drawers in my home, and it's probably best there.
What do you think you learned through that experience, though? Because it's often the case that is, that's how we learn, isn't it, as novelists?
Yes, expediency.
Yeah. Yeah. Was that the main lesson for you?
It was. I remember putting it into a box and going, well, it was a couple of years well spent. I hope I learned something, and if I ever do this again, I'll write something saleable, bloody, and short.
That's a good motto to have.
It is always a good motto.
So what would be your sort of, so how do you write? I mean, obviously, Did the way that you write change between, apart from the expediency thing, and obviously, as you say, thinking about a little bit more about finding something that was marketable or whatever? Did the way that you write in terms of your process? Do you tend to sit down and plan the structure and the whole story out, or do you just, you've got your premise and a rough idea of where you're going, a bit like a road trip, and off you go?
I tend to be very agnostic about matters like this. I mean, whatever works and whatever works on a given day. And if what seemed like gospel yesterday isn't working today, then plan a new course. I know that in Dodgers, I understood the story very well from the beginning. I had a very good sense of where it was going, and that produced one way of relating to and writing the story. What I'm working on these last couple of years, I lack that single, the eastward drive of the narrative, the car trip. I lack that particular engine, let's say, in narrative terms. And so I've had to think and work in different ways. I'm pulled along much more by the characters and by the relationships I hope to build between episodes. Then I don't know if this sounds really high-minded and abstract and dull. I fear, but it's been a very different ride this last couple years of working on and getting close to finishing a new book. What I can say is that I used to work best in the early morning. I'm not as, for some reason, I'm not as bright in the early morning as I was a few years ago, and
Right.
and so I'm finding ways to do it later in the day. I've gotten pretty good though at being able to shift into book brain and shift out fairly quickly, and I think that's a real I'll just say it's a real gift to be able to pick up right where you left off, as if the pan is still hot.
I agree, because I think that's, a lot of writers would say that that's really tricky to do, especially if you've got a day job and you've got obviously family and all the other real life commitments that come into play in these things, and being able to just pick it up and go for it. So do you tend to find that you write sort of, again, it sounds like you've not got hard and fast rules with it, but do you tend to find that you write on a daily basis, or is it when the mood takes you, or how does that tend to work out?
Oh, definitely daily. I think that's really important to me now, and I used to be absolutely the other way. I used to have this kind of harebrained idea that when inspiration struck, I would then drop my life and write all night long and through the morning and through the next day, and drink gallons of coffee and wave away my family imperiously, and I'm writing, be gone. And not only is it absurd, it's relatively unsuccessful. I remember visiting a friend of mine some years ago, and my wife and I visited him in his home in North Carolina, and he got up in the morning and we were still asleep, and it turned out to be that the room we were sleeping in was his writing room, and he very much wanted us to get up and get out so he could get some work done. And I remember thinking, just what a drag that is,
to actually just have one room that you can do it in.
Yeah, I mean, he had been writing as long as I had, and he had 5 books by that time, and I had squat, but his method was obviously ridiculous. And it took me years to come around to suggesting, or to considering that it might actually be a good idea to do it as he did.
Yeah. So what would you say is your favourite part of the process? Is it very much the kind of white heat of the first draft, or do you enjoy redrafting and editing? What's your favourite part?
Oh, that's hard to answer. I have there are chapters that you love, and there are chapters that you come to love because you've revised them in ways that surprises you and pleases you. And then there are chapters that I think all you're ever going to do is you're going to play for a draw. You're going to see if you can get 1 point and get out. But it's lovely, particularly a chapter that you thought would work one way, and you come up with a far more elegant solution for whether that's structural or whether it's just textural. Those are favorite children.
That's what you enjoy. So, as regards, obviously you're teaching creative writing. How does that? Do you find that there's that sort of bleeds into your own work? How has it changed since Dodgers? Does the way you approach your teaching, is it different? Is it very much do as I say, not as I do, or is it how does that work?
I do think that they're kind of disjointed worlds for me. There may be some insight that I've added to my professional palette, my teaching resources. There may be some insight that has come from my own writing, but I also fear that teaching at a women's school as the one man in the room usually, I fear being the old gas bag at the front of the room going, the way I would do it. In fact, the way I've done it. In fact, let me tell you a story. Yeah. I try to, as a teacher, stick to the script. I think it's merciful. It's much easier on the students. It's also much more likely to get me to a good lesson in the end.
But have you been inspired by your students? Has some of their enthusiasm and their attitudes, do you find, has that any of that influenced you at all?
Absolutely. Most inspiration comes from, yes. Students are always a source of sheepishly going on and finding hope in the future.
So what would you say has been your biggest challenge or roadblock that you faced along the way, and sort of tell me how you overcame it creatively?
Do you mean in writing?
Yeah.
Gosh, I've been very, very lucky. The book that I'm working on now has been challenging in ways that Dodgers was not. In that I'm having to work with a character who is much less easy for me to love than East was. I have some real disagreements with my character now, and finding a way to convey that character, to make that character fitting as the central star of a novel, but also to continue to argue with that character it's a real struggle. It has taken me some time, and as this book is a successor to a book which was well received and well loved, I want to do it right. I don't just want to get it done. So Dodgers has been a hard book to follow.
Well, I was going to ask you about that because, as you say, it was well received and it was award-winning as well, and you got some great notices for it. How much has that played on your mind when you've been writing the follow-up? That difficult second album.
Yeah. I began a sequel to it. Began it not long after the book came out. It took me a while to realize that was maybe the hardest thing that I could be doing. And I got 200 pages in and put that in a drawer, a different drawer. It's a house of many drawers. So I both fought against and ultimately capitulated to some extent to the difficulty of following the book in a direct linear fashion. What I'm writing now is a cousin, we might say, to Dodgers.
So it's sort of related to the same sort of world, is it? Would you say?
It is. That's well put.
And so that when you started that sequel, was that on your mind because the book had been well received? Was your automatic thing, well, I should follow this up with, more from the same story and carry and continue it, or was that something that was kind of suggested by publishers, or was it a bit both?
There's actually, I wouldn't say that it was suggested by publishers, but I remember that I guess this was early October of 2014, when the book sold, editors asking, I had a series of phone interviews with editors who were interested in buying the book, and the editors all asked, do you have a sequel in mind? And I absolutely didn't. Mm-hmm. But But it occurred to me in the space of maybe 15 seconds the first time I was asked.
I know what you're going to say.
The protagonist is alive. There he is. He's going off into a sort of, let's see, trying to say this without spoilers, right? He's made somebody very dangerous, very angry.
Yeah.
And I am sort of leaving myself in ideal position for a sequel. So though I hadn't ever thought of it until that moment, I said, no, of course.
Sure,
of course I'm thinking of a sequel.
Yeah.
Because, you never think of actually telling your editor the truth
of course
about your intentions.
That would be a big mistake.
Yeah. I mean, you might as well just talk yourself up like you know exactly what you're doing.
Yeah, it's as good as written. Yeah.
Because,
absolutely. So, I mean, that's something that does occur to me on hearing you say and mention the sequel and the fact that you talked about the original idea with this was that it was going to be a screenplay. Is that something that's in the works, or that you would consider a film adaptation or a TV adaptation or whatever? Because it does seem really suited to that, especially with the popularity of other TV programs and books and everything else that are in that genre.
Well, let's hope. I'd love to see it, and there has been some interest, and we'll hopefully there'll be something to say in the next year or two about that. Right now, I try not to get my hopes up about anything I can't control, and this is certainly something I can't control. So.
But it's a possibility. Oh, that's good.
And,
that's good to hear.
I suppose all sorts of things are possibilities, but we'll see what comes of that.
Absolutely. So, if you were starting again tomorrow, a new career as a writer, if you could go back to before you wrote that first book, what if anything would you do differently, or what would you go back and tell your younger self to either do or not do? Do you think?
Oh, if I could go sufficiently back, I would have taken up some niche of writing in the arts that would actually get me out of the house. I had an aunt, a great aunt, an aunt of my mother, who, since I was maybe 12 or 13, sent me the New Yorker magazine at my address in Michigan, and then my address in Ohio, and then my address in Florida. It came to me, not my family. It was a great gift, and I tended to read the critics first, the movie critics, the art critics. Occasionally there were popular music critics, and I would have become one of those people. Going to premieres and writing notes in the dark, and then writing reviews in the newspaper for a good magazine. I would have had to overcome some social phobia to do that, and I would have had to work really hard. But that's what a marvelous life, and I still envy the folks who do that, who review and who teach us and who shape our ideas about new work, and I might have gone that way.
Do you think that's a case of self-belief or lack of self-belief at the time when you were younger?
Oh, you mean that I didn't do that?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know how to do anything when I was younger. High school prepared me beautifully for college. College prepared me for nothing. I had and I remember many of my friends feeling this way, that we came out of college endowed with this grand analytical framework for anything. We could make fun of anything, but we had no idea what now to do with ourselves.
Sure.
I spent 2 years working subsistence jobs in a big city, and then I fled back into school because at least I felt in 4 years I'd learned how to do that.
It had prepared the ground for more academia.
Yeah. Right. I mean, any good industry works on currying and addiction in its customers, and God knows academics are no different.
There's worse addictions to have.
I suppose there are.
So what's the most, as we sort of move towards closing, what would you say is the most helpful piece of creative or inspirational advice you've been given over your life?
You know, my undergraduate professors, actually a husband and wife team, Stuart Freebert and Diane Brules, always used to tell us that you have to love your characters, even the ones who are loathsome people. Mm-hmm. That you have to figure out how to be on their side and how to make them not only sort of appealing on a sort of moment-to-moment level, but how to get to the ways in which they appeal to themselves, or they appeal to the people who are like them, how to learn to love them. And at my best, that's right in the center of the desk. I can't always say I'm at my best, but it's great advice.
And would you say that's the part of the writing that you enjoy the most, when that's going well and you can make that connection with your character?
I would. It's a good day when I'm connecting with the character. I also love sentences, and my favorite writers are crafters of beautiful sentences, and so to take that answer a different way, in a different direction. I'm happiest when the sentences sound good, sound right.
And do you tend to edit as you go along, or do you just tend to go dirty first draft, get all the way through, and then start revising?
I wish I did the latter. I wish that I could leave dirt in chapters and go back when I had the entire. God, what I wouldn't give to have that sort of discipline. But no, I'm somebody who is dusting surfaces before the roof is even on the house. every day.
You just can't bear to leave it like rough or anything, and
I can't bear it.
Well, that's, lots of people are like that. Well, it shows in your writing. It is really, really polished, and as I say, I loved Dodgers. It was excellent. So what's up next? It sounds like you're working on the book that's the cousin to Dodgers, and is there anything else going on, and where can people find out more about you?
They can't find out more about me anywhere. There's really very little. There's almost nothing beyond what we've discussed here today, sir. That's both the best and worst thing about me. I do not, actually write much right now beyond the sort of center of the fairway fiction I'm doing. What I'm doing next is getting 3 classes ready and getting a haircut and trying to come out and do my job competently, as most of us have to do on a Monday.
Absolutely.
I wish me luck on that.
Just regular Monday stuff. Well, I do wish you luck with it, with the upcoming term and with the book. Have you got any estimated time of arrival on that, or is it just when it's done?
Oh, I would happily take another 10 years, but I'm not sure that I'm going to be allowed to. I don't know. I'll certainly have it done by the end of the year. I mean, it's all in one piece. I'm just not sure there's a lot of dusting and polishing to be done, and I'm I can't allow it out of the house before it gleams.
Well, happy dusting.
Thank you.
And thanks for joining me on Joined Up Writing. I really appreciate it. It was great to chat.
A pleasure. I enjoyed it very much. Thank you.
Okay, thanks again to Bill Beverly, and I highly recommend Dodgers, which is out right now. I'll put all of those links in the show notes over at joinedupwriting.co.uk. That's it for this week, but don't forget you can find the entire back catalogue of interviews on the website. Make sure you subscribe at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, Overcast, or wherever else you get your podcasts from to have the podcast downloaded automatically every episode. Also, remember to get in touch with all your writing news, views, questions, or comments, and I'll give you a mention in a future show. Until then, thanks for listening. I'm Wayne Kelly. Happy writing and reading, and I'll see you next time.
Joined up